He promised one more season. 40 years later, the valley still guarded him. I was 26, the first time I told a dying animal I'd stay. Aldenmore Reach wasn't much of a posting. A grain valley wedged against a demilitarized ridge, 300 settlers, and me, the authorities' one assigned warden, sent out with a rifle I never fired, and a mandate nobody upstairs expected to matter. The reclamation fleet ran its culling sweeps through frontier valleys like ours every few years, clearing out unregistered predator stock before it could grow into something a colony charter would have to account for. Nobody thought Aldenmore was worth a second sweep. That's probably why the first cub survived long enough for me to find her. She was Kethrani, armor-plated along the spine, all elbows and unfinished growth, curled in the wreck of her mother's den, with a reclamation drop marker still smoking 20 yards off. The sweep had come through at dawn and left nothing else breathing. I don't know why I picked her up instead of filing the standard report. I've had 40 years to think about it, and I still don't have a better answer than, she was the only living thing in that valley that morning, and I was standing right there. I told her I'd stay until she was grown. I didn't say it because I expected her to understand me. I said it because somebody needed to hear it, and there wasn't anybody else left to say it to. I named her Corin. That was the whole plan. One cub, one promise, one season. The fleet came back 18 months later. Different valley on paper, same pattern. A sweep team, a scattering of orphaned young too small to register as a threat and too inconvenient to leave breathing. I filed for a transfer that year. Command offered me a training post, 2 systems over. Better pay, real walls. I turned it down and didn't examine why too closely. By then there was a second animal living under my porch, a lean pack-hunting thing with too many teeth and a habit of following me on my rounds like I was the last stable thing in a valley that kept losing pieces of itself. That's roughly how the next 30 years went. Not one dramatic decision, just a warden who kept finding reasons the transfer could wait another season, and a valley that kept handing him what the sweeps left behind. A insectoid brood orphan that wouldn't stop screaming until I sat with her through 3 straight nights. A wolf-coated pup so thin I could count every rib through his coat. None of them were the same species. None of them had any evolutionary reason to tolerate each other, let alone fall into step behind one aging human who fed them out of the same cracked bucket every morning. They did it anyway. I stopped trying to explain it in my reports and started just writing down what was true. The valley isn't undefended. It never was. It's just guarded by things command doesn't have a form for. Corin was the one who set the shape of it. By her 10th year, she stood taller at the shoulder than I did at the door. By her 20th, she was the one the younger arrivals fell in behind without being told to. Not because I'd trained her to lead, but because she was the first, and something about a pack remembers who held the door open first. I used to be able to carry her in one arm. By the time I couldn't lift my own water barrel without help, she could have carried me the length of the valley without slowing down. I got old the ordinary way. Bad knees, a cough that never fully cleared, hands too stiff most mornings to manage the porch latch without help. Help that, by then, came in the form of a Kethrani alpha nosing the latch open for me before I'd finished reaching for it. Command's files still listed Aldenmore Reach as a single warden post, minimal asset value, low strategic priority. I stopped correcting the paperwork somewhere around year 20. Let them think it was one old man out here. It was easier that way, and it turned out to matter more than I understood at the time. Grand Provost Ossic Dre had been a junior officer on that very first sweep, the one that killed Corun's mother and left her in the wreckage for me to find. 40 years is a long time to build a career on the strength of a valley you assume you already broke. By the time he came back, he wasn't running a sweep team anymore. He was running the reclamation fleet's entire frontier campaign, and Aldenmore Reach was the easy, symbolic opener he needed. One undefended valley, one aging warden, a clean broadcast victory to prove the frontier had gone soft while nobody was watching. He brought cameras. He brought 4 transport wings. He did not bring the expectation that anything in that valley would still be alive to meet him, let alone grown. I watched his lead wing come down the ridge road from my porch step, coffee going cold in my hand, and I didn't call for anyone, because I never had to anymore. Corin was already moving before I'd set the cup down. Where she went, the others followed. Not 4 separate animals reacting to a threat. but one shape that had spent 4 decades learning to move together, because every one of them had learned to walk by following her, and she had learned to walk by following me. I won't pretend I remember the next few minutes in order. I remember Dre's forward line hitting something they'd been briefed didn't exist. I remember the insectoid brood, grown into a coordinated wall nobody's sensors had flagged in 20 years, taking the flank apart before it finished forming up. I remember the wolf-coated pup, not a pup anymore, hadn't been for decades, coming off the ridge rocks in a way that made trained soldiers forget which direction retreat was in. And I remember Corin herself, rising to her full height in front of the cameras Dre had brought to record his victory, close enough that he had to look up at the animal whose mother's death he'd signed off on before he was old enough to know what the order meant. He didn't lose that valley in a fight. He lost it standing still, live on every screen his own coalition was watching, backing his transport away from a ridge his intelligence briefs swore was undefended. A commander only gets to survive that kind of retreat once. By the time his wing finished scattering, the broadcast had already gone out across 3 systems, the single warden post, holding, and not alone. The relief column that came 3 days later, same as it always did, found me sitting on the porch step with a torn sleeve, and nothing worse. 5 grown predators arranged around me in the loose, unhurried formation they'd have held whether or not anyone was recording it. The officer leading the column asked, carefully, whether Aldenmore Reach required reinforcement. I told her the valley had never once needed reinforcing. It had needed feeding, 4 times a day, for the better part of 40 years, and I'd been glad to do it. The delegation that followed wasn't a courier this time. It was 3 colony officials who'd watched the broadcast and wanted to see the arrangement for themselves. They stood in my doorway the way Dre's soldiers had stood on the ridge, very still, very quiet, looking up. Somebody finally asked what the settlers had taken to calling it, the thing that had apparently been sitting undocumented in a frontier valley for 4 decades. I told them the truth, because there wasn't a shorter version. They wrote it down as, "The Valley Remembers," and it's in the official record now, whether Command's asset ledger has caught up to it or not. I don't walk the ridgeline much these days. My knees settled that argument a while back, but most mornings I still sit on the porch with my coffee, and 5 animals that could each end a man's life without slowing down still arrange themselves around an old warden like he's the one who needs watching over, which at this point, he probably is. 40 years, and the paperwork still calls it a single warden post. I've stopped correcting that too. Some numbers were never going to tell the truth about who was actually standing at that door.